The mediator looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something embarrassing in public. Not angry. Just tired. Like she had seen this before and already knew how it was going to end, and the ending wasn't going to be good for me. I remember thinking, I ironed this blouse this morning. I got here 20 minutes early. I brought a folder with every document sorted by date and tabbed with color-coded stickers, because that is the kind of person I am. And none of it mattered, because my husband had just told a room full of people that I had been having an affair with my business partner for the better part of 2 years. And the worst part, the part that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it, is that he brought someone to prove it. I need to back up. My name is Joanna. I'm 34 years old. I live in Oakville, Ontario, which is the kind of town where people wave at each other from their driveways and drop off casseroles when you have a baby or lose a parent, and where the absolute last thing you want is to become the subject of gossip. I have a landscape architecture firm that I built from zero, literally from a folding table in the spare bedroom of our first apartment, into something that employs 11 people and holds contracts with 3 municipalities in the GTA. I love my job in the way that some people love their children, not instead of, just, the same category of feeling. My husband's name is Seth. We met in university in Guelph. He was studying business administration and I was in environmental design, and we fell in love the way you do when you're 22, and the whole world feels like it was built specifically for you. We got married at 27. We bought a house at 29. We had a plan. What I didn't account for was what happens when one part of the plan works out and the other part doesn't. Seth spent 6 years trying to get a product idea off the ground. It was a sustainable packaging concept. Compostable mailers, that kind of thing. The timing wasn't wrong. The market was there. But the funding never came together the way he needed it to, and by the time the categories exploded, someone else owned it. He ended up back in a corporate job at 31, managing a logistics team for a distribution company in Mississauga. He was good at it. He got 2 promotions in 3 years. But it wasn't what he had wanted, and I think he knew the distance between what he had wanted and what he had was never going to close. I don't say this to excuse what he did. I say it because I spent a long time trying to understand it, and this is the closest I've gotten. The person I need to tell you about, the person who becomes the center of this whole story, is a man named Philip Okoro. Philip is a licensed landscape architect. I hired him 4 years ago when my firm won a contract for a community park redevelopment in Burlington, and I needed someone with specific experience in accessible pathway design. He came recommended by a colleague I had trusted for years. His work was exceptional. His rate was $720 a day, which I did not negotiate because the scope of the project justified it, and because when someone is that good at what they do, you don't nickel and dime them. Philip has been my business partner for 2 years. We split equity 60-40, my favor, because the firm existed before him and the client base was built on my relationships. He handles the technical side of large infrastructure projects. I handle everything else: proposals, staffing, finances. We are colleagues. We have never been anything other than colleagues. Philip is also gay, which is not remotely relevant to the story, except that it becomes relevant in the most infuriating possible way later. Seth and I started having problems around the time the firm won its biggest contract to date, a green corridor project for a regional municipality worth just over $2.1 million over 3 years. I was working long hours. I was distracted. I was not as present as I should have been. These are true things, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. What I am going to tell you is what Seth said to me in the kitchen in February of last year. He said, "I know about you and Philip. I remember the specific thing I was doing. I was transferring leftover soup from a pot into a container because the pot was too big for the fridge shelf. I stopped mid-pour and looked at him and said, "What about me and Philip?" And he said, "I know you're sleeping with him." I set the pot down very carefully because I didn't trust my hands, and I said, "Seth, Philip is gay." And Seth said, "That's what he wants you to think." I don't know how to describe the feeling of that moment, except to say that something went quiet inside me. Not hurt, not even angry. Just quiet. The way a room goes quiet when a sound you've been hearing for so long you stopped noticing it suddenly stops. I knew in that moment that we were not going to fix this. Whatever this was, jealousy, resentment, something he had been building quietly in the dark for months, it had gotten to a place where evidence wasn't going to reach it. I moved into the guest room that night. I contacted a family lawyer the following week. What I did not expect was what came next. Seth retained a lawyer almost immediately. He filed for divorce on the grounds of adultery, which, in Ontario, means he was claiming that the marriage broke down because I had been sexually unfaithful. He was asking for an equal split of the matrimonial home, plus a portion of the business, on the grounds that he had financially supported me during the early years of the firm, and was therefore entitled to a share of its current value. His math was not entirely wrong. He had supported us both for 14 months while I built the business, living off his salary and some savings. What his math ignored was that I had also paid down $60,000 of the mortgage in the 3 years after the firm became profitable, and that the increase in home value in that period was largely attributable to the landscaping and property improvements I had done myself. But none of that was the part that scared me. The part that scared me was that he had a witness. My lawyer, her name is Renata, and she is the kind of person who makes you feel like the crisis is already half managed just by the way she answers the phone. Told me this during a call in early March. Seth's legal team had indicated they intended to present a witness who would corroborate the adultery claim. She didn't know yet who it was. I ran through every name I could think of: a neighbor who had seen Philip's car in the driveway, a colleague who had misread something. I couldn't land on anyone. Then 3 days before the mediation session, Renata called again. She said, "The witness is someone named Kyle Mercer." I had to ask her to say it again. Kyle Mercer had worked for me for 8 months, about 2 years prior. He was a junior drafter. Smart, fast, a little arrogant in the way that people are when they're 24 and have just figured out they're talented. I let him go because the firm went through a slow quarter and he was the most recent hire. It was a business decision. I gave him a strong reference letter. I thought we had parted on decent terms. Apparently not. I don't know exactly what Seth promised him or how the conversation started. What I do know is that Kyle had signed an affidavit stating that, while employed at the firm, he had personally witnessed what he described as inappropriate physical contact between me and Philip on multiple occasions in the office. Renata read it to me on the phone, and I sat very still and did not say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "None of that happened." She said, "I know. Tell me everything you remember about the office setup during the period he worked there." Here is what I remembered. We had a glass-walled boardroom, a bullpen with 4 desks, and my private office in the back with a door that had a small window in it. Philip worked remotely 3 days a week. Kyle sat in the bullpen and had no line of sight to my office. Renata said, "Good. And do you have anything else? Anything at all?" I thought about it. I went home and I sat at my desk and I opened my laptop and I started going through files. I want to tell you about a habit I developed in the first year of running the firm when I was paranoid about liability and documentation because I had seen a colleague lose a contract dispute because this She couldn't prove she had done what she said she had done. I started keeping a log, not a diary, just a simple shared document that I updated at the end of every workday, noting who was in the office, what we worked on, what decisions were made, and by whom. It wasn't formal. It was just something I did because it made me feel like the ground under my feet was solid. I had 2 years of that log from the period Kyle worked for me. I searched his name. I found every day he had been in the office, what he had worked on, whether Philip had been on site, for the occasions Kyle had listed in his affidavit. The specific dates he claimed to have witnessed something. I cross-referenced with Philip's remote work schedule, which I also kept because I billed his days differently, depending on where he was working. On 3 of the 4 dates Kyle named, Philip was not in the building. On the 4th date, I found something better. I found an email chain between me and a client that showed I had been in a video call from 1 p.m. to 3:40 p.m., time-stamped with the client's name on it. The time Kyle specified in his affidavit was 2:15 p.m. I forwarded everything to Renata. She said, "Joanna, this is very good." I did not feel relieved. I felt the way you feel when you've been running from something in the dark and you finally reach the light switch. Not safe yet, just able to see. The mediation was on a Thursday in April. It was held at a neutral office in downtown Toronto, one of those boardrooms that tries very hard to feel calm and ends up just feeling beige. Seth was already there when I arrived. He didn't look at me. Renata was next to me on one side. Seth's lawyer, a man named Harris who had the energy of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by anything, was across the table. The session opened with procedural things. Assets. The house valuation, which had come in at $1.3 million. The business valuation, which was the number I had been dreading. My firm had been assessed at $1.1 million based on revenue and client contracts, and Seth's team was arguing he was entitled to a significant portion based on his early financial support. I had documentation for all of it. The mortgage payments, the business account records, the timeline of contributions. Renata had organized everything into a binder that I had reviewed so many times I could have recited it. Then Seth's lawyer said they wanted to address the adultery claim. He said they had a witness present who was prepared to give a statement. The door opened. I had been expecting Kyle. The arrogant 24-year-old, 2 years older now, coming in to say things that weren't true because someone had made it worth his while. I had been bracing for that specific discomfort, the particular humiliation of being lied about by someone you had tried to be decent to. Instead, a man I had never seen before walked in. He was older, mid-40s, I thought. Well-dressed. He sat down across from me and placed a laptop on the table and folded his hands on top of it, and he looked at Seth's lawyer, not at Seth, and certainly not at me. Seth's lawyer said his name was Kyle Mercer. I looked at Renata. She looked at me. Something passed between us that I couldn't entirely name. Harris began to lead Kyle through his statement. The dates. The things he claimed to have seen. His voice was steady and practiced, and it had the quality of something that had been rehearsed, not in a theatrical way, but in the way that careful lies are rehearsed, just enough to be smooth. I was watching the laptop. When Harris finished, Renata stood up. She said calmly, "Mr. Mercer, could you tell us what the layout of my client's office was during the period you worked there?" Kyle described it. He got some things right, the bullpen. The general location of the private office, Renata said. And from your desk in the bullpen, did you have a direct line of sight to the interior of my client's office? Kyle paused. Just a beat, he said. Yes. Renata pulled out a photograph. A floor plan, actually. The one I had submitted to the city of Oakville for a minor renovation permit in the first year of the business. It showed, clearly, the angle of the bullpen desks relative to my office door and the wall that sat between them. She said, "This is the office layout on file with the city. Can you point to where your desk was?" Another pause, longer. He pointed to a location that would have been behind a wall. Renata said, "Thank you. I'd also like to enter into the record the following." She placed a stack of pages on the table, the daily log, the remote work schedule, the email chain with the time-stamped client call. She walked through each date Kyle had named in his affidavit. On March 4th, she said, Philip Okoro's remote work log indicates he was working from his home in Hamilton. A Teams login record corroborates this. On March 4th, Mr. Mercer, who did you observe? Kyle didn't answer immediately. His lawyer, Seth's lawyer, said, "My client," Renata said. "I'm asking a factual question about what he saw." The mediator asked Kyle to respond. He said, very quietly, "I may have misremembered the date." Renata went through every date. The same pattern each time. Philip was elsewhere, or I was documented as being on a call, or there was a record of some kind that made the timeline impossible. By the fourth date, Kyle had stopped responding to the questions directly. He was looking at the table. Then Renata said, "Mr. Mercer, is it possible that you didn't witness any of the things described in your affidavit?" The room was very quiet. Kyle looked at Seth for the first time. Seth was looking at his hands. Kyle reached out and opened the laptop. He turned it to face the mediator. He said, "I need to show you something." What was on the screen was a text conversation between Kyle and Seth. It started 8 weeks before the mediation date. I'm not going to reproduce the whole thing, but the relevant part, the part that the mediator read in silence for a long time, was Seth, in his own words, explaining what he needed Kyle to say, how specific the dates should be to seem credible, and what Kyle would receive in return. The number Seth offered was $8,000 to be paid in 2 installments. Kyle had kept every message. I didn't know he was going to do that. Renata didn't know either. She told me afterward that she had prepared for him to be hostile, not honest. She had never expected him to walk in and blow up his own testimony. I asked her later why she thought he did it. She said, "Probably because your husband stopped answering his texts after the affidavit was signed." The mediation session was suspended. Seth's lawyer asked for time to confer with his client. The mediator agreed. We were in a separate room for 40 minutes, and I remember sitting there looking at a framed print of a birch forest on the wall and thinking about nothing specific. Just the birch trees, the way they look in November when the leaves are gone and the bark goes almost silver. Renata came back in and sat down next to me and said, "He's withdrawing the adultery claim." I said, "What happens to Kyle?" She said that was a matter for the Law Society and potentially for Crown Counsel, not for this process. Suborning false testimony is serious. She said Seth's lawyer was already looking like a man who wanted to be in a different profession. I said, "What about Seth?" She said, "That depends on what Kyle decides to do." But the text messages are evidence. If Kyle chooses to go to the authorities with them, Seth has a significant problem. I found out 2 months later that Kyle had filed a complaint. The matter was referred to the Crown. Seth ultimately accepted a peace bond, a conditional agreement to keep the peace for a period of time, with the adultery claim fully withdrawn. It was not nothing, but it was also not everything. I know what he tried to do. The peace bond is a record of that. The financial settlement took another 6 weeks to finalize. The house was listed in June and sold in July to a couple from Brampton who, according to our realtor, said they were planning to tear out the front landscaping and start fresh. When she told me that, I laughed a little, not bitterly. Just the particular absurdity of it. I had installed that front garden myself over 2 weekends in the spring we moved in, and someone was going to bulldoze it without knowing it existed. I kept the business. That was the part that mattered most. The settlement acknowledged that Seth's early financial contribution had been offset by my subsequent mortgage payments, and that his claim to equity in the firm was not supported by the documentation I had provided. I paid him a buyout on the home equity that accounted for his actual contribution. It was fair. I don't think either of us felt particularly good about it. Philip found out about all of it in stages. I had kept him out of the legal proceedings as much as I could because I didn't want his professional reputation affected, and also because I didn't want him to feel responsible for something that was not his fault. When I finally sat down with him and explained everything, the affidavit, the text messages, what Kyle had done in that room, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You have a really good filing system." And I said, "I know." He said, "I'm serious. Most people don't have a Teams login record from 2 years ago." I said, "I keep everything." He said, "I know you do." He smiled at the table. That's why we're still here. I moved into a rental in Burlington in August, a small place near the lake, with a balcony I've since filled with container plants, which is the landscape architect version of nesting. I run the firm from the same office I've had for 4 years, with the same glass-walled boardroom and the same bullpen, and Philip still works remotely 3 days a week, and I still update the daily log at the end of each day, because some habits are there for a reason. The thing I think about most when I think about that year is not Seth. It's not even Kyle. It's the folder I had in front of me on the table at the mediation, the one with the colored tabs and the sorted documents, and the quiet certainty I had that I could prove, for almost every date in question, exactly where I was and what I was doing and who could verify it. I didn't build that folder because I thought I would need it. I built it because I was the kind of person who kept records, and that kind of person had become that kind of person by accident years before any of this, because she had watched someone else lose something important for the want of a paper trail. The birch forest print is still in that mediation office, I assume. I think about it sometimes. The way it looked in November, the silver bark, the bare branches, things stripped down to what they actually are. That's what documentation does, in the end. It doesn't make the truth. The truth was already there. It just makes sure the truth can be seen.